hear a child crying or screaming in pain or something, you're very sensitive to it, and you're there immediately. And most mothers can tell whether it's what the meaning of the crying is or the meaning of screaming. If it's something that you need to get there right away, or it's just a couple of kids arguing with each other or something like that. But there's being kind of alert to it. And we have to be the same way to ourselves, to the things that are going on in our mind. And we have to talk at some length about, if anyone's interested, how one would train oneself to have spiritual wakefulness. And it's again something that requires some kind of effort on our part. And sometimes what we have to be wakeful against is about worrying too much. Is about being spending too much time worrying and fretting about things, because we do need to trust God. We do need to trust Christ. And we need to not take ourselves too seriously in this respect. Sometimes we take ourselves so seriously that we're worried and fretting and concerned all the time at every small little thing that occurs in our lives. And we need to just not take ourselves quite so seriously at times. That the issues or problems we think we have are often absolutely nothing compared to what other people have. And yet they survive, so you're going to survive too. But this constant worrying and constantly being concerned and constantly trying what's going to happen next, what's going to happen if, what will happen if. Well, maybe if won't even happen, so then this won't happen either. So just, as we used to say in the 60s, don't sweat it. Don't sweat the small stuff. Trust God and trust our Lord Jesus Christ. And the more we have that trust and that faith, the less we worry, but the more well things actually work out in the end. And that's part of it. The things will work out in the long run. And so we don't need to spend quite so much time with worrying and fretting. Sometimes we worry and fret so much because of our own egotism, because we're the center of the world. And so it's really, really important what's happening to us or how we're reacting. And really it's not nearly so important. Even when problems develop in marriages, very often it develops in small ways. It's very often small things that build up over a period of time. Sometimes it's something dramatic. But generally, it's small little things that build up model for model, little by little, over a period of time. And if we have a spiritual wakefulness, we're aware of those things. And if we aren't really egotistic, then we don't take those little things quite so seriously. And we know how to reconcile ourselves because of them. And I'm really far more interested in how people living in the world and married people can use spiritual wakefulness than I am in how it's going to be used in the monastic situation, because there's something to take care of that. But for people living in the world, it's not so easy. And even to form a concept of it. But basically, we need to try to train ourselves to be alert about a problem or temptation or some situation that's beginning to arise. And we know how something like that will affect us because we're alert. We know something about ourselves. And consequently, we know when to avoid that, when to turn away and leave, and when to say, well, look, this isn't that serious. It's just my ego playing on me. I'm not after all Napoleon or Alexander the Great or Caesar. Not very many people are really depending on me that way. So this is not such a serious matter. Do I really need to talk to my husband or wife about this, or is it just my ego that wants to talk about it? Am I getting irritated at somebody because there's something irritating, or because my ego is being irritated? And so spiritual wakefulness will help us to judge and assess those things a little more carefully. And remember that so many of the problems, irritations, and anger that you have, that you think somebody did something, but as a matter of fact, the real problem is not what they did, but your own ego. As if to offend me is worse than to offend somebody else, because after all, I'm me. This is something that spiritual wakefulness will help us to judge and help us to avoid these kind of situations. So, anyway, does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, it was it was said exactly. If you want to be happy, just stop to feel sorry about yourself. Something like this. It tells about your people's ego again. That if you feel sorry about yourself, then it's kind of you know.
Yeah, well, self-pity is one of the worst passions, because self-pity is it's based in egotism, but a person who practices self-pity also loses the normal self-esteem, and people have to have a certain normal self-esteem. That's one of the really important things between husband and wife. You should help each other to maintain their normal self-esteem, and never do anything that's going to lower that person or rob them of their normal self-esteem.
Yeah.
I think if you really love somebody, you can do that. And sometimes, when we get angry, we try to cut the person down somehow, and that's really a bad sin.
Not in this
to do
society.
That. But it's a lot of our self-pity when we feel sorry for ourselves all the time, and that really undermines our spirit and our soul of self-pity. And a person who's full of self-pity can never find any kind of real contentment and therefore no real happiness, because no matter what that happens, you feel sorry for yourself, as if you're the only person in the world who had any problems and were suffering. And very often our self-pity is over things that ultimately don't matter too much.
In today's world, we need a lot of wakefulness for television and internet.
Well, that's one of the things about television. There are these constant studies that nobody pays attention to, and yet they're very solid and sound studies about how much damage television does to small children, to infants, and to the shaping of children's characters and lives. Remember that your character is shaped by the time you're 6 years old, and all you can do after that is to change attitudes, but you can't really change character. And when children are brought up on television, sometimes they use it as a babysitter,
Yeah.
And by the time they're 6 years old, television will shape their character and their personalities in a way that ultimately you can't change. You can try to change attitudes, but you're not going to change the character. It's there. And beyond that, there are constant studies about how television creates violence. But television also changes the language, and it vulgarizes the language. It uses words that once upon a time you would have had your mouth washed out before if you used it. And it teaches people that this is just common language. And it isn't common language.
It desensitizes.
It desensitizes to everything. Somebody gets killed in one television show and they're alive in the next television show. So, it's, even the idea of death and violence become twisted and changed. But above all, it corrupts the language so that we become more vulgar, have less human respect, less inner human respect, and less capability of actually having love for each other, and just increases an overall air of violence. But it also instills people with abnormal fears sometimes.
Also,
even the newscast can sometimes, for a small child, or somebody who's preteen, can actually ultimately instill abnormal fears in them.
And also, a lot of people see the glamour and having affairs and running around and partying.
Well,
I notice a lot of that affects the teens a lot.
Well, sure, it just becomes commonplace, and it destroys. One thing I remember, even as a teenager in school, the boys could always spot a girl who was sexually loose. You could always tell which ones were. And one reason was that they had a certain coldness about them. Their face kind of hardened a bit. And there was just a coldness and a hardness about them. And that's because having sexual relations at too early an age really damages people's psyche. It really damages people's character. And in a way that's very difficult to recover from. And by the time they're ready to get married, there's nothing left. It's all been done before. So there's no foundation or no basis for the marriage. And it